July 22nd, 1985, Nolensville, Tennessee. After failing to pick up his wife from the bus station, 79-year-old George Owens and his car are discovered to be missing from his home. 1 week later, George's abandoned vehicle is found on a hilltop in a rural wooded area over 100 miles away, and piles of kindling are found outside and in the back seat. Eyewitnesses report having seen George in the area, looking disoriented, leading to speculation that he wandered off into the woods, but a search effort fails to turn up any trace of him. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring a pair of unsolved missing persons cases involving elderly victims, the disappearances of George Owens and Walter Dunson. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Laura Ayers, the latest winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Laura. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for nearly 3 years now, and if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions at the end of this episode. Anyway, as you probably know, due to the recent events which have been taking place in the world, the Trail Went Cold has decided to spend the last half of June and all of July covering unsolved cold cases in which the victims were persons of color, and on this episode, we're going to explore 2 cases which fit that criteria. If you're an Unsolved Mysteries fan, you're probably familiar with the story of George Owens, which is often ranked as one of the most saddest, heartbreaking segments ever featured on the show. And frustratingly, even though the case is still unsolved to this day, the segment is currently not available for viewing on Amazon Prime or YouTube. But since the date of this episode's release just happens to be the 35th anniversary of George's disappearance, I thought now would be an ideal time to cover it. However, since there isn't a ton of information available about George's case, I've decided to include another story about an elderly African-American man named Walter Dunson, and it might be one of the most bizarre missing persons cases we've ever covered. Walter was officially reported missing by his son when he would have been 98 years old, but once investigators started digging into the case, they discovered that no one else could actually confirm having seen Walter in nearly 2 decades, and that his son may have had ulterior motives for keeping his disappearance a secret for a long time. Anyway, I'll start off this episode by talking about George's story before I provide my theories and analysis, and then I'll move on to Walter's case. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the unsolved disappearance of George Owens. Our story begins in 1985 in Nolensville, Tennessee, a small town of around 1,500 people located just over 20 miles southeast of Nashville. Our central figure is a 79-year-old African-American man named George Owens, who lives with his 77-year-old wife, Aileen Owens. The couple were high school sweethearts and have been married for 60 years, and after retiring from his job as a custodian during the 1960s, George became the associate minister at Nashville's New Hope Baptist Church. He is considered to be a very well-liked and respected citizen within the community who never misses his Sunday services. On the morning of Monday, July the 22nd, George was scheduled to drive to Nashville and pick up Aileen at the bus station as she was returning from a trip to Ohio to visit her niece. Aileen's overnight bus ride arrived at 6:30 a.m., but to her surprise, George was not there to meet her and he never showed up. The couple had spoken on the phone at around 3 p.m. the previous afternoon, where George joked, quote, "Well, I'll meet you if I don't oversleep." Indeed, Aileen hoped that George had simply overslept, but after waiting for an hour, she finally decided to call George's brother, Alfred, and asked him to come pick her up. Alfred attempted to call George, but received no answer, so he went to meet Aileen at the bus station and drove her home, where they discovered that both George and his green 1972 Dodge Dart were missing from the garage. Two place settings with the couple's Sunday dinnerware were on the dining room table, and the only clothing which appeared to be missing was one of George's black suits. A black hat which George had worn every day since Aileen gave it to him for his birthday 1 month earlier was left behind, and the couple's dog was also wandering around the house and appeared to have not been recently fed. Alfred became concerned enough that he immediately contacted the police and reported George missing. Neighbors would say they last saw George leaving the house on the afternoon of July the 21st, driving his Dodge Dart on Nolensville Road towards Nashville, which made them wonder if he was planning to pick up Aileen one day early. For 6 days, there would be no sign of George until his family was notified that his abandoned car had been discovered on a remote hilltop overlooking the Tennessee River in a rural wooded area in Perry County. The keys were still in the ignition, the battery was dead, the driver's side window was down, the back door was open, and George's cane was resting against the car. There was also a box of matches on the dashboard, even though George had quit smoking a long time ago. The strangest detail was that there were a number of piles of tree branches and brush surrounding the vehicle, as if someone was planning to start a fire, and a pile of kindling was stacked up in the back seat next to George's suit jacket. According to George's family, it was a common habit for him to go around his house, pick up wood, and place it in piles. The only access to the hilltop was a very rough and rocky logging road, which would have been difficult for George to navigate. While there were no obvious signs of struggle or foul play, a search and rescue operation was launched in the surrounding wooded area, but they could find no trace of George. Since this location was over 100 miles away from George's home, no one could figure out what his car would have been doing there. When a local television station aired a missing persons bulletin with George's photograph, it wasn't long before a number of people came forward who claimed to have recognized him. One of these witnesses was Larry Potts, the owner of a garage in the town of Santa Fe, who claimed that sometime between 9 and 10 a.m. on the morning of July the 22nd, George stopped at his establishment to get a flat tire repaired. This was around 3 hours after he was scheduled to pick up Aileen at the bus station, and it was unclear what George was doing in Santa Fe to begin with, since it was nearly 50 miles southwest of Nashville. However, Potts thought that George looked a bit confused, and said that he wandered around with his cane for around 30 minutes while he replaced the tire before George paid him in cash. He also recalled George asking him for directions to Nolensville before he left and turned north on Highway 7. Another sighting of George would subsequently take place in the town of Lobelville, located in Perry County, about 55 miles west of Santa Fe. On the afternoon of July the 23rd, Mary Jo Phoebus, a clerk at a Lobelville market, claimed that a man matching George's description walked into the establishment and purchased some ice cream before walking back outside to his car. However, a few minutes later, George re-entered the store to purchase some cigars, and he was also given a box of matches. But afterward, George started talking about how he couldn't find his wife, and went on about how they used to love dancing together, which gave Phoebus the impression that he may have been disoriented. She decided to call the local clinic to see if George's wife might be there, but there were no patients matching her description. George then left the market, and that was the last time he was confirmed to be alive. However, there would be one more sighting of George's Dodge Dart later that afternoon. The remote hilltop where the vehicle was discovered was about 12 miles from the market, and a local resident who lived near the site remembered seeing the Dart drive uphill on the logging road towards the spot. But interestingly enough, the witness also said there was a pickup truck following George's car uphill on the same road before they saw the truck re-emerge and drive downhill about 15 to 20 minutes later. This led to speculation that the person driving the truck may have had an encounter with George on the hilltop, but neither the truck nor its driver was ever identified. Based on the reports of George's behavior at the garage and the market, it was theorized that he might have suffered a medical issue, such as a minor stroke, which caused him to become confused and drive to a remote location over 100 miles from his home before he vanished. Sadly, Aileen Owens was left completely devastated by her husband's disappearance, stating, quote, "After being together all that time, I can't get used to losing him, least not the way I lost him," end quote. She eventually moved out of her house into an apartment and passed away in 1989. The case would be profiled on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in August of 1992 and featured interviews with George's brother Alfred, but the segment failed to generate any promising new leads. The following year, George was officially declared dead, and his grandson would inherit $33,000 from his estate. But after 35 years, there are still no answers about what actually happened to George Owens. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So if you were to ask an Unsolved Mysteries fan which moments from the show put a major lump in their throat, all you would have to do is utter these 5 words: I can't find my wife. Yes, the reenactment in the market depicting a disoriented George Owens reminiscing about his wife and acting concerned about being unable to find her is definitely one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the history of the show. Say what you will about the quality of the acting in some of these reenactments, but the elderly actor they found to play George was very, very good, and that scene is one of the big reasons people still remember this story all these years later. But as you can imagine, it's quite frustrating that this segment is currently not available for viewing on the usual channels. Now, I'm sure you know that I have a particular fascination with mysteries in which someone goes missing or is found dead at a faraway location they had no reason to be at, and while the story definitely fits that criteria, it's less mysterious when you're dealing with an elderly victim. It seems very likely that the reason George wound up in a remote area over 100 miles from his home was because he suffered some sort of medical issue which affected his memory, whether it be a minor stroke or an undiagnosed case of Alzheimer's or dementia. Years before they aired this segment, Unsolved Mysteries actually profiled a similar story about another elderly African-American man named Rogers Kane, who vanished after leaving his home in Los Angeles, and his abandoned car was eventually found on a city street. Based on the accounts of some eyewitnesses who interacted with Rogers, signs pointed to him having some sort of medical issue which caused him to lose his memory and forget who he was. While Rogers was never found, the best case scenario was that someone could have picked him up and taken him to a medical facility for treatment, where he lived out the remainder of his life as a John Doe because no one could identify him. But in this case, George Owens' vehicle was found in a rural wooded area in the middle of nowhere, so the odds of him being picked up by a good Samaritan and taken somewhere for treatment are not great. No matter what you believe happened to George, the visual from the Unsolved Mysteries segment of his abandoned Dodge Dart sitting on that remote hilltop with a pile of kindling in the back seat and George's cane resting against the car is incredibly eerie. What adds an extra element of tragedy to this story is that George sounded like an all-around good person, and he left behind a wife, Aileen, who had been with him for 60 years. As you can imagine, it was not easy for Aileen to adjust to life without him, but it was extra difficult since he was missing, and she had no idea if he was actually dead or alive somewhere. It sounds like George and Aileen rarely spent time apart, so it was just bad luck that he may have suffered some sort of medical issue on the one day she happened to be out of town visiting relatives. If this had occurred while Aileen was at home, she may have been able to prevent George from driving off. Now, on the basis of the Unsolved Mystery segment, I initially theorized that George had gotten confused while he was on his way to pick up Aileen at the bus station in Nashville on the morning of Monday, July the 22nd, which caused him to drive in the wrong direction and become lost. However, upon further research, it now seems that George may have actually left his home on Sunday, the 21st. We have neighbors claiming they saw George driving away from the house that afternoon, and there were 2 place settings found at the table, with what Aileen specifically described as their Sunday dinnerware, even though her bus was not scheduled to arrive until Monday morning at 6:30 a.m. So I get the impression that George had gotten it into his head that he was going to pick up his wife that day and bring her home for Sunday dinner. Aileen said she last spoke to George on the phone on the afternoon of the 21st and did not notice anything unusual, as George did say that he was going to meet her at the bus station the following morning, so it must have been a short time later that he suffered a stroke or something, which caused him to become confused and disoriented. In fact, it's possible that George even drove to the bus station to pick up Aileen on the 21st and was totally thrown off when she did not arrive, which explains why he was later seen going on about how he couldn't find his wife. The next confirmed sighting of George took place between 9 and 10 a.m. on the morning of the 22nd, when he stopped at the garage in Santa Fe to get his tire replaced. According to the owner, Larry Potts, George appeared to be lost and asked for directions before he left. This might go a long way towards explaining why George wound up where he did, because it sounds like when he asked for directions to Nolensville, there may have been a misunderstanding, and Potts instead gave him directions to Lobelville, which was over 50 miles in the opposite direction. And sure enough, George was seen in Lobelville the following day. Now, in missing persons cases, you're always going to have sightings of the victims from eyewitnesses who were mistaken about who they saw, but given where George's car ultimately wound up, I think it's safe to say that the eyewitness sightings in this case are accurate, and the evidence demonstrates that George wound up in an unfamiliar place because he was disoriented. The Lobelville market clerk, Mary Jo Phoebus, was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, and she was clearly haunted by the fact that even though she made an attempt to call the local clinic to help George find his wife, she wished she could have done more to help him. At first, people were baffled when a box of matches was found on the dashboard of George's car, since he had given up smoking a long time ago, but Phoebus confirmed that she gave those matches to him when he purchased cigars at the market. Even if George had not smoked in a while, he may have bought the cigars instinctively because he was remembering old habits. Given that it takes just over an hour to drive from Santa Fe to Lobelville, and these separate sightings took place over 24 hours apart, this begs the question, what was George doing during that period of time? In fact, if he actually left his home in Nolensville on the 21st, what were his whereabouts before he turned up in Santa Fe on the morning of the 22nd? It's incredibly sad to think that George may have been driving around aimlessly looking for his wife for nearly 2 straight days, and you have to wonder if he spent those nights sleeping inside his car. It's still not clear how George's car wound up on that remote hilltop 12 miles outside of Lobelville, but he may have simply gotten lost and became very confused when he arrived at the location, since there was only one road in or out of there. On the surface, the detail about the piles of kindling being found inside and around the car might seem pretty baffling, but it makes more sense once you learn that George had a habit of collecting wood and assembling piles at his house. So once again, it seems like he may have instinctively been doing something which was a familiar habit. I know that Aileen expressed her belief that George would not have placed that kindling in the back seat himself because he always went out of his way to keep his car spotless, but if he was disoriented, he would have been capable of anything. It's possible George did this because he was planning to spend the night at that location, but of course the big mystery is, what ultimately happened to him? Well, of course, the obvious explanation would be that he wandered away from his car into the woods and died of exposure. Even though an extensive search and rescue operation was launched and they failed to find George's body, he had already been missing for a week by that point, so any number of things could have happened to his remains, such as them being torn apart and spread around by animals. There are numerous documented cases where someone went missing in a remote wilderness area and a search effort failed to turn up anything, but then years later, someone just happened to stumble across the victim's remains, which had been completely missed during the original search. I guess what differentiates this case from many others is that George left his cane behind, and you have to wonder how far he would have been able to walk without it. Theoretically, if he did succumb to exposure, this should have occurred only a short distance from his vehicle, making him easier to find, but as it's been proven time and time again, even the best search and rescue operations can miss human remains. However, the one detail which might lend credence to the idea that George was a victim of foul play is the eyewitness sighting of the pickup truck, which appeared to be following George's Dodge Dart on the logging road towards the hilltop where the vehicle was found. That same truck was then seen heading back down the road in the opposite direction, and the driver has never been identified. Now, this took place in Perry County, which is the least densely populated county in the state of Tennessee, so what are the odds of two strangers driving separate vehicles on that very remote logging road so close together? Since it sounds like this road was the only way to reach the hilltop, you'd have to think that even if the pickup truck driver was a completely innocent bystander, they would have at least seen George up there and might have some useful information to offer. But on the other hand, if the driver harmed or abducted George, perhaps they drove away from the location with his body inside their truck, which would explain why he was never found. I guess it's possible that someone could have seen George acting confused and disoriented in Lowellville, and because of his age, they decided to take advantage of the situation and followed him to this remote location. George was wearing a gold watch and a ruby ring at the time he went missing, and neither of these items were found, so this could have made him the potential target for a robbery. And given that he was an African-American man, and this was the rural Deep South, perhaps he was targeted for some sort of hate crime by a racist local. Of course, these theories are nothing more than pure speculation, and without the sighting of the pickup truck, there probably wouldn't be any reason at all to suspect that George was the victim of foul play. The eyewitness also said the truck was only out of sight for about 15 to 20 minutes before it drove back down the logging road, which doesn't sound like near enough time to dispose of George's body unless they took George with them when they left the scene. But given the remoteness of the location, why would they bother to do that? So in the end, I do think the most logical explanation is that George simply wandered off into the woods and died of exposure, and they just simply never found his body. But unless they uncover any evidence someday, we'll probably never know for certain. All that being said, if you happen to have any information on the unsolved disappearance of George Owens, please contact the appropriate authorities. Anyway, now let's move on to our next case. Our second story begins in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1998, and our central figure is an elderly African-American man named Walter Dunson. On June the 5th, Walter's 50-year-old son, Gary Adams, contacted the Cincinnati Police Department in order to report his father missing. By this point, Walter was 98 years old, less than 1 month shy of his 99th birthday, and according to Gary, his father had spent the past 20 years living with him and his wife at a small, rented brick house in the Kennedy Heights neighborhood. Gary claimed that he had taken Walter out shopping to Findlay Market on Elder Street, and at around 2 p.m., they momentarily separated when Gary went inside a butcher shop to purchase some steaks. But when Gary exited, he discovered his father was gone and could not find him anywhere. After Gary filed a missing persons report, the police spent the next several days canvassing the neighborhood and performing a door-to-door search, but could find no trace of Walter. However, from the moment they arrived at the market to respond to Gary's call, investigators got an odd feeling and felt that Gary came across as very unemotional about his father's disappearance. He also seemed very impatient, as he wanted to leave the scene in order to pick up his wife from work, and even went so far as to turn down an officer's offer to pick her up for him. At one point, Gary even told the police that there was no need for them to do anything else because he would find his father himself. When asked for a photograph of Walter, Gary claimed that he did not have one because his family did not believe in taking pictures. After ignoring this request for several days, Gary eventually agreed to sit down with a police artist and provided a detailed description of Walter so they could produce an age-enhanced composite sketch. When the sketch was circulated to the employees at Findlay Market, most of them could not recall seeing anyone matching Walter's description on the afternoon he was reported missing. A clerk at a beauty supply shop believed he may have sold Walter a lottery ticket, and while another eyewitness did recall seeing an elderly man at the market, she thought he appeared to be in his 60s or 70s and much younger than Walter's age of 98. The market's employees also claimed that at no point were they ever approached by Gary or anyone else to post missing persons flyers for Walter. Investigators became even more suspicious when they visited Gary's rental house where Walter supposedly lived. The residence windows were covered with foil, and the bedroom where Walter supposedly slept had a very musty-smelling bed and very few personal items, giving off the impression that no one had lived there in quite some time. The room was also located at the top of a steep flight of stairs, which would have been very difficult for a 98-year-old to navigate. And even though a search of Walter's hospital records showed that he had a history of medical problems, no prescription medication could be found under his name at the residence. When investigators spoke to Gary's landlord and 6 of his neighbors, they claimed that Gary and his wife were known for being very reclusive. Even though Gary's wife had 2 sons from a previous relationship who had lived at the residence in the past before moving out, no one had any recollection of an elderly man living there. While Gary's wife backed up his story that Walter had stayed with them, things got even more bizarre when investigators spoke with Brian Bias, Gary's 23-year-old son from a previous relationship. Brian currently lived in Columbus, though he often traveled to Cincinnati to visit his father and stepmother at their house. Not only did Brian tell police he had never met his grandfather, but he said he was completely unaware that Walter even existed until he was reported missing. In fact, back in 1988, Brian had spent 2 months staying at his father's residence and even slept in Walter's bedroom, but he never saw Walter at all. This prompted investigators to do a deep dive into Walter's background to try and determine the last time he was confirmed to be alive. It turned out that Walter was originally born near Marietta, Georgia, though different birth dates from 1899 and 1900 would be listed in different records. This discrepancy may have been due to the fact that Walter had lied about his age in order to enlist in the military and serve in World War I, where he wound up being awarded the Bronze Star Medal for bravery. While there was no record of Walter having legally married, he was believed to have had 8 or 9 children throughout his lifetime. However, Gary claimed that the family never kept in touch, and he had no idea where his mother was or if she was even still alive. At some point during his life, Walter moved to Cincinnati and got a job at a local iron foundry where he worked for 40 years before retiring in 1970. Following his retirement, Walter started drawing a pension and Social Security benefits, and he was still collecting and cashing all of the checks he received until he turned up missing. But other than the checks, it seemed like the official paper trail for Walter came to an end sometime around 1980. His driver's license had expired during the 1970s and was never renewed, and the last surviving paperwork for Walter were records of him having visited Cincinnati's University Hospital on 3 separate occasions in 1980 for such issues as dementia and possibly a stroke. Apparently, Gary had accompanied his father to the ER for one of these visits, but got tired of waiting and left before Walter was treated. In spite of these medical issues, there were no subsequent records of Walter having visited a doctor, making an insurance claim, having prescriptions filled, or holding a bank account, and Gary would attempt to explain this by claiming that his father had stopped believing in doctors and banks. When Walter's composite sketch was circulated in the media, he was recognized by a number of people who remembered him, but of course, none of them had personally seen Walter in years. He was a frequent patron at an establishment called the Elder Cafe, and he'd also been an usher at Calvary Baptist Church, but aside from a pastor who thought he'd seen Walter shortly before 1986, most of the people who recognized him could not recall having seen him since around 1980. A former counselor from a local homeless shelter called the Drop-In Center recognized Walter and claimed that he used to stay there, but once again, had no recollection of him after 1980. When Walter's composite sketch was shown to current employees and residents from the shelter, no one recognized him. Investigators were finally able to turn up a photograph of Walter, which had been published in a church bulletin in 1973, but no recent pictures of him seemed to exist. Since Walter did not appear to have a death certificate, he was cross-checked with unidentified John Does from the morgue, but none of them were a match for him. Over a month after he reported his father missing, Gary decided to provide an exclusive interview to the Cincinnati Enquirer in an attempt to explain why no one else could recall having seen Walter in 2 decades. He stated, quote, "Basically, we are reclusive type people. In 18 years, not one neighbor has been in here for so much as a cup of coffee. If anything, we're guilty of being antisocial," end quote. Gary claimed that since Walter had spent much of his life working the overnight shift at the iron foundry, he had a habit of sleeping and watching television during the day and would only go outside at night for the occasional walk. He also said that Walter kept to himself because he feared that their family would get into trouble for having too many tenants at their residence, though the landlord would later clarify that there was no limit on how many tenants could live there. Anyway, the pieces of this puzzle started to come together once investigators learned of a significant event which took place right before Walter supposedly went missing. As you recall, Walter had been collecting Social Security benefits since his retirement, and whenever one of the recipients was reaching a really advanced age, it was standard practice for the Social Security Administration to send them a letter in which they requested a meeting with one of their field representatives in order to verify they were still alive. Well, wouldn't you know it, since Walter was only 1 month shy of his 99th birthday, one of those letters was sent to the address they had on file for him, which happened to be Gary's residence, and only 4 days after it was sent, Gary went to the police and told them that his father had vanished at Findlay Market. It turned out that Walter had collected over $100,000 in pension and Social Security checks. In fact, between May of 1996 and June of 1998, 25 Social Security checks, totaling more than $21,000, were co-signed by both Walter and Gary and deposited into Gary's bank account. This led investigators to suspect that Gary had been keeping up the false pretense that his father was alive in order to collect his benefits, so in February of 1999, Gary was indicted on 25 federal counts of theft of public funds, as well as 25 federal counts of forgery. He would go on trial for these crimes in May, and wound up being convicted on all 25 counts of theft, though the jury acquitted him on all counts of forgery. Since no existing samples of Walter's handwriting could be found, a comparison could not be made in order to conclusively prove that Gary had forged his father's signature on the checks. Regardless, Gary was sentenced to 27 months in prison and ordered to pay restitution. The court took into account the reported sighting of Walter by his church pastor during the mid-1980s and concluded that Gary had fraudulently cashed all of his father's Social Security checks between 1986 and 1996, so the total amount of restitution he owed was $129,853. However, since no trace of Walter's body could be found, authorities were unable to prove that Gary was responsible for his death. In 2014, a detective from the Cincinnati Police Department announced that they were reopening the case in an attempt to find Walter's remains, and during a news report shown on a local TV station, Gary's son, Brian Bias, was interviewed. He said that he was still searching for answers about his grandfather and publicly urged his father to do the right thing and reveal what happened to Walter. But thus far, Walter Dunson continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. Wow, so unsolved missing persons cases are sad enough, but what can you say about a story where a person vanishes and the last 2 decades of their life just seem to vanish along with them? I first came across this story several years ago when I wrote an article for listverse.com titled 10 People Who Weren't Reported Missing for Years. In those cases, when an official missing persons report was filed with the authorities, it turned out that no one could actually confirm having seen the victim alive for years beforehand. And for the most part, it seemed pretty obvious that someone close to the victim was responsible for their disappearance, but managed to conceal it for years. In fact, if you watch the new version of Unsolved Mysteries, which just got released on Netflix, you probably saw the episode about the disappearance of Lena Chapin, who also got featured in my ListVerse article, since the last confirmed sighting of Lena took place in 2006, but no one actually reported her missing until 2.5 years later. But the story of Walter Dunson is just on another level altogether. I'm sure the authorities don't have to deal with many missing persons reports involving victims who are 98 years old because, well, most people generally don't live that long. But when a 98-year-old man just seemingly vanishes into thin air in a crowded public place, and almost no witnesses can recall actually having seen him there, that's a major red flag. No matter what transpired, I think the one indisputable fact that we can all agree on is that Gary Adams is a colossal douchebag. Even if he was not directly responsible for Walter's disappearance, he obviously had no qualms about collecting his father's Social Security checks and cashing them for himself. This is far from the only case you'll find where someone concealed the death of a relative in order to collect their benefits, but people generally don't get away with a scheme like that for as long as Gary did. And that's pretty much the biggest issue with conclusively solving this case and figuring out what happened to Walter, because Gary would have had a lot of time to cover his tracks. But man, even if you put aside his disappearance and the scheme with the checks, there are a lot of unanswered questions about the life of Walter Dunson. I mean, obviously, what ultimately happened to Walter is not that mysterious, but his backstory seems to be. Walter's story kind of reminds me of those Lost Heirs segments from Unsolved Mysteries, where a reclusive person would pass away with a lot of money in the bank, and investigators would have to dig into their mysterious backgrounds in order to find an heir to their estate. What we do know about Walter is that he was originally born in Georgia, lied about his age in order to serve in World War I and earn the Bronze Star, and he spent 40 years working at a Cincinnati foundry before his retirement, but there are a lot of holes in his family background. All the sources state that even though Walter never officially married, he apparently fathered 8 or 9 children throughout his life, but aside from Gary Adams, there doesn't seem to be any information out there about these children. All Gary said was that the family never kept in touch, and he didn't even know if his own mother was still alive. So did Walter father these 8 or 9 children with the same woman? Or did he just get around a lot? If you listen to the episode I released last year about the disappearance of Clifford Sherwood, you might recall that his father, Tex Sherwood, had a habit of starting multiple families with multiple women before he would completely abandon them and start over with someone else. So did Walter live a lifestyle like that? We have reports of Walter staying at a homeless shelter in 1979 or 1980, which seems to suggest that he had fallen on hard times in the years following his retirement, so I'm not sure if this means he severed his relationships with most of his children. Did none of these children ever ask about Walter or attempt to contact him during the 18-year period when his whereabouts were unaccounted for? What seems apparent is that at some point, Walter must have moved into Gary's rented house in Kennedy Heights, because that was the address the Social Security Administration had on file when they kept sending him checks for 2 decades. Indeed, when Walter turned up missing, Gary's mother-in-law said that she did have memories of having to watch him a few times, but the last time she remembered seeing him was back in 1978. So we know that Gary and his wife lived in that residence, and they both maintained that Walter had stayed with them for 20 years. It sounds like Gary's 2 stepsons lived there and had moved out before Walter was reported missing, but they've never publicly commented on the situation and confirmed or denied having seen Walter. However, Gary's biological son Brian has always maintained that he never even knew his own grandfather existed, and while he did not live with Gary at the residence, he had visited and stayed there numerous times and never saw Walter. Gary's explanations for how Walter could have lived in that house for 18 years without anyone in the neighborhood seeing him are beyond absurd. There are records of Walter visiting a local hospital to deal with medical issues on 3 separate occasions in 1980, but the way Gary tells it, his father just suddenly stopped believing in doctors, which is why there are no records of him having attended any more medical appointments or gotten any prescription medication since then. Kind of miraculous that an 80-year-old man with all these medical issues would go on to live 18 more years without dealing with any further problems. The only person who thought they might have seen Walter after 1980 was the pastor from his church, who thought that he might have seen him sometime before 1986, but I think there's a pretty good chance they're mistaken. Gary's actually quite lucky the court took this sighting into account when determining how much money he owed for cashing Walter's checks, because otherwise, his restitution would have dated all the way back to 1980 and been even higher than $129,000. Now, if you think Gary is a truly evil, irredeemable monster, the most obvious solution to this mystery is that he murdered his father and disposed of his body before spending the next 18 years cashing in on his benefits. But given his health problems at the time, it's also possible that Walter did legitimately pass away of natural causes, but instead of reporting it, Gary decided to conceal his father's death and get rid of his body so he could keep collecting his pension and Social Security. I mean, that's still an incredibly crappy thing to do, but at least it wasn't murder. The third possibility is that since he was reportedly being treated for dementia in 1980, perhaps another George Owens situation occurred where Walter became disoriented and wandered off and legitimately disappeared. He subsequently became a transient and wound up as an unidentified John Doe somewhere when he died. Gary might have had such indifference to his father that he never bothered to report him missing, so the checks wouldn't stop coming. I guess this is the least evil scenario, because even though he was still committing fraud, Gary may have genuinely had no idea what happened to Walter. But regardless of how these events played out, this was still an incredibly stupid scheme on Gary's part. How exactly did he think this was going to end? Did he believe that the Social Security Administration would just keep sending checks to Walter until he was 150 years old? It's just way too much of a coincidence that Walter would turn up missing almost immediately after he was sent a letter about a field representative wanting to meet him in person to verify he was still alive. While it's good that Gary had to serve time in prison for his acts of fraud, the authorities have said that unless they can turn up Walter's remains, it's unlikely they'll ever be able to prosecute Gary for anything related to his father's death. As far as I know, Gary Adams is still alive today, but he has never revealed what actually happened. Like I mentioned earlier, even though this story is incredibly bizarre, it's not much of a mystery, but I still thought it was important to cover it to ensure that Walter Dunson was not forgotten. During the aforementioned news report about this case, aired in 2014, an anchorman stated that if Walter had a grave, it would acknowledge the Bronze Star Medal he received for bravery during World War I, but unfortunately, due to the unanswered questions about what happened to him, he does not have a final resting place, which is the least he deserves. So if you happen to have any information about Walter's disappearance or the possible location of his remains, please contact the Cincinnati Police Department at 513-352-3542. That's 513-352-3542. Anyway, another special thanks to Laura Ayers for narrating the opening of this episode. If you've already entered our contest before, you are automatically eligible for my next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you would like to enter, and haven't done so yet, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released an episode on a final appeal case from Unsolved Mysteries about the controversial conviction of Steve Shores, a young resident from Chicago's South Side who served time in prison for the murder of a security guard, but maintained that he was framed by the real killers. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Kelly I, Astrid Maria K, Angela C, Nisa, Daniel C, Fiona O, Ragnhild S, Lauren B, and Christy M. Thank you all so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.